So I would say that I've been a fan of Brandon Ingram's since he was drafted. If you were expecting him to be a huge scorer from his very first year, which I'll admit I was expecting that a bit too, just because of everything that everyone said about him when he was coming out of college, then I guess you could say his rookie season was a little disappointing. But instead of just writing him off, I looked into other things that he was doing besides being a scorer in his first season with the Lakers. And what I always took note of with Ingram was his appreciation, number one, to be a part of a team, which for a 19-year-old who is a big deal, you sometimes fear that, you know? But it seemed like he was pretty okay with not being the main dude on offense or the second dude or whatever. But then I also took note of the little things he can do in terms of, one, just grabbing 4 rebounds a game, which for a starting point at 19 years old I thought was a good sign, and he's become a better rebounder this season. I also made note of the fact that he was making plays for other guys. I mean, 2 assists per game doesn't jump out at you, but there were enough games in his rookie season where he was getting maybe 5 to 7 assists or something on top of showing some real ability in the pick and roll that made me say, there's something here, and this dude's just going to have to figure out the shooting and just finishing and all that stuff. And it seems like Ingram is beginning to do that a bit more this season. His scoring average has nearly doubled to 16 points a game, improvements in his passing and his rebounding. His turnover percentage has crept up a bit as well. I'm not going to freak out about it yet. He's only 20 years old. He's got all the time in the world to not cough the ball up as much. But I think a good question we can have with Brandon Ingram is, like, what is his ceiling? Can he be the best player on a championship team? Can he be the second best player, the third best player? Let's dive into it. I mean, I think the ceiling for him is probably the second best player on a title team, just because when you're saying the best dude, you're talking like LeBron James, Steph Curry, Kobe Bryant level, and I mean, that's a lot to ask of. And I think with Ingram, if he was going to get to that point, he would either have to become an exceptional shooter, and while his shooting percentage of 38% from 3 is actually very good, he only attempts like under 2 a game, so it's really not that high. So he would either have to become really good from there, become great at getting to the free throw line and also finishing at the free throw line. He's shooting about 68% at the line this year on about 5 attempts a game, which is actually not a bad sign. But I'm talking like he'd have to get to near James Harden levels in terms of finishing. So I can see him becoming pretty good at both of those things, but I'm talking like 7 to 8 3-point attempts a game, shooting high 30s, potentially even 40%. That's difficult to do given where he's at right now. But if we can dive into just what I see from the guy, I mean, the ball handling is a pretty real thing, I would say. Ingram does not have exceptional athleticism. He's a decent athlete, but he's not blowing by guys on the regular. He's not constantly in isolations, beating guys off the dribble all the time. Doesn't mean he can't do it, but it's not something that I would ask him to do consistently. But what I do notice is when he gets a screen from Randall or Brook Lopez or whatever, he's pretty competent at just knowing what to do, getting the defender on his back, using the screen effectively. And I think that's a good sign for someone who's a wing player, small forward, power forward sort of deal. And he has seen quite an improvement from his rookie year to this year in terms of just his effectiveness in the pick and roll. So last year he was in the 16th percentile of pick and roll ball handlers on about 2.5 possessions a game, whereas this season Ingram is at 44% in the 44th percentile on about 5 pick and roll possessions a game. I think that's a pretty good improvement in 1 year, you know? I think it's a good sign how willing he is to go to his pull-up mid-range. Just looking at some of his highlights lately, I remember a couple of pull-up mid-ranges he had over Tyson Chandler in the Suns game. There were some others that I just can't remember off the top of my head. But he goes up with it pretty quickly. And they have actually been like somewhat contested by like taller players, and he's still able to get it over them comfortably. That's a good sign. He's also pretty okay at making the obvious pass, so defense brings help, guy open in corner sort of thing. I don't know if we'll ever see Ingram really slicing apart defenses and anticipating the help and all that to the point where we could see him averaging like plus 6 or 7 assists a game, but I mean, is it really that ridiculous to think that Ingram can average a solid 5, 5.5, occasionally 6 a game when he's in the prime of his career? I don't think that's that ridiculous to expect given where he already is as a passer. And another thing that could help him with that is I do think he has gotten better just as a ball handler overall this season. He's not doing crazy like between the legs moves and behind the back all the time, but he does typically need a screen to help him out. But once he's able to get by that initial line of defense, he's got like some craftiness to him in terms of maybe it's like a half Euro step, or maybe he just does a really good job at keeping the dribble alive, even in contested traffic, or the way he'll gather the ball up for a layup. He's deceptively pretty good at handling the basketball under duress, and I do think there's another level he could get to just in terms of craftiness. And I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see him be like Giannis levels of just having an impossible spin move. A lot of that because, I mean, Giannis is just insanely athletic, and I don't think Ingram has a chance to really get to that level. But that's okay if you have ways to make up for it, you know? I could even say that sometimes the way he'll gather the ball and prepare himself to shoot at the basket or shoot a floater or angle himself around a defender, he even kind of reminds me of James Harden a little bit, because Harden also has to make up for the fact that he's not a crazy athlete. Now, Harden has the advantage of just being really strong, whereas Ingram is a bit skinny, of course. But I think that says a lot of good things about a 20-year-old, you know? And it should be said that his finishing at the basket has been excellent this season, shooting around 67% at the rim, which is a pretty big improvement from his rookie year where he shot like 61%. So if you fast forward a couple of seasons and you have a guy who, we'll say he gets a little bigger, a little stronger, able to not bounce off defenders as much, which was a pretty decent problem in his rookie season, and he's able to power through guys a bit more, draw a few more fouls just from being generally bigger, and you assume he gets a little better as a ball handler and all that, I think Ingram could be a really effective inside scorer. I can't think of an exact comparison. My brain immediately went to Joe Johnson like a little bit, just because Johnson was really good from like floater range and mid-range territory, and he wasn't a great athlete either, and he was also taller than the average wing because he was 6'7". I guess something in that world, but I think Ingram has potential to be a better rebounder. And I mean, Joe Johnson, to his credit, was around 6 assists a game for a decent stretch of his career, so you know, maybe that comparison holds some weight, I don't know. But Ingram, if I can get to some negatives, I do think he sometimes does a little too much, sometimes gets a little too out of control, maybe sometimes biting off a little more than he can actually chew offensively. I mean, he's 20 years old. If that's not going to happen for a guy who has the ball in his hands, you know, a somewhat decent amount of the time, his usage rate is at 22%, then that player would be something really special. So hopefully that just doesn't happen as he gets older. And I do think he's gotten better at that even this season, you know. But if we can get back to the shooting a bit, because while I think he can be an effective inside scorer, like I mentioned before, if he really wants to realize his potential, then he's got to go to like a different level as a shooter. I mean, the form is good. I think his pull-up mid-range game shows like a good sign, because he's actually been a pretty decent long two-pointer this season, where he's been shooting 43% on, right now, 146 attempts this year, which is a bit more than the amount of threes he's taken, which is at 100. I think it's baby steps with his shooting. I don't know if it was just the shortened line in college just was good for him, and the three-point line just a little too far out. I do think that's what we're kind of seeing. And I think his free throw shooting in college was a pretty good sign that he really wasn't all the way there as an outside shooter yet. But I think it's getting along. But again, do I think we're going to see him just knocking down threes on the regular 4 years from now? It is a little tough to predict that, given what he's started out as. I mean, even on this recent run, which you can say has been the best part of his career so far, there are still multiple games here where he's only taking like one three-pointer. Now, he also had one where he went 4 for 5 against the Mavericks, but still, I think he's got a ways to go there. So, I think it's safe to say I don't think he can be the best player on a title team, even with the improvement that I anticipate him making. But I think the second best player on a title team, and if he's your best player, you might still be like a 50-win team. I think that's pretty damn good, you know? If I can fast forward a couple of years, I will predict that Brandon Ingram's overall game, we'll just say box score numbers, says something like, we'll say 21 points a game, 5.5 assists, 6.5 rebounds, shooting 35% from 3 while taking about, we'll say 3 to 5 a game, shooting a solid 6 or 7 free throws a game where he can hopefully get to like 75% from the line. And overall being a guy that you can play at the 3, you can play at the 4. I think he's got pretty okay potential as a defensive player, part of that just because of his size, but also he seems to care about defense, which is good. And just overall being a really solid overall player, kind of like a better version of Nicholas Batum when he was in his prime for the Blazers. Something like that, something that every team would love to have, but if he's your best player, you're probably not a championship contender. I mean, that sounds like a damn good player to me, you know? So, that's what I would say about Brandon Ingram. He's been exciting, he's been good lately for the Lakers, as they just keep on winning, although last night Damian Lillard jacked the three-point sliders up and they lost, but that was a pretty insane finish. Ingram's good, man. He's definitely good, and I like him. So, I think the Lakers have a good player on their hands, and we'll just have to see where he can go.